Good day and welcome to my Witchcraft History series. If you want to start at the beginning, part one, you will be able to learn all about the history of witchcraft down the timeline. Others will just watch the videos that they're interested or called to. But if you do want to know the entire timeline, start at part one and work your way up to this one. So today I'm going into the burning times. The late Middle Ages saw the start of widespread persecution of witches. Torture was used to extract confessions, and the victims were often burned alive. The persecution was patchy. Virtually non-existent in some areas and very existent in other areas. The possible causes of this mass persecution are still debated upon today. The widespread execution of alleged witches from the late Middle Ages until the start of the 18th century is easily the most controversial period in the history of witchcraft. Even the name often used by modern witches to describe this period, the burning times, causes disquiet among some historians. The name, in fact, is the number of witches, for example, in England, North America, and Spain, that were hanged and not burned at the stake. More seriously, the name bellies or belies implies a concerted and uniform campaign of persecution over a set period. In fact, the execution of witches started gradually from about the 14th century and rose to a peak in the late 16th and early 17th century, and then slowly faded. However, this pattern varied enormously from country to country and even from district to district. In some areas, persecution was frenetic, widespread, and seemingly out of control. In others, there was barely any persecution at all. Perhaps the most emotive question of all is just how many died during this period of 200 to 300 years. The first point to make is no one knows for sure. Trials and executions were carried out locally, and not all the documentation has survived. Details were certainly not kept in central records or filing cabinets. The best estimate ranges from around 40,000, which seems to be on a very low side, to around 100,000. What can be safely stated is that the claim made at the end of the 19th century was that there was as many as 9 million people that may have lost their lives in the witch craze and do not even stand up to even the smallest scrutiny. From a historical point of view, the precise number of those who died is important, but not the main issue. The essential task is to try to understand why many people lost their lives in such a grotesque manner, having first been tortured into confessing to the most bizarre and unlikely of activities. For on one point, there can be no doubt this was a shameful episode in the history of Western society. There is no starting date for the witch craze in Europe. From as early as the 12th century, there was a gradual increase in the arrest, in the trial, and the executions of supposed heretics against the Orthodox Christian teaching. At the same time, it was becoming increasingly accepted among theologians, and the Pope inspired inquisitions that witchcraft involved the participant in making a pact with the devil and rejecting God. This made witchcraft one of the most serious heresies. The Christian Church and secular authorities regarded witches as heretics, and they died a heretic's death, being burned alive. And the sinister image of the devil, usually depicted with horns, cast a long shadow over the persecution of witches from the late Middle Ages on. One pope, Boniface VIII, who died early in the 14th century, was himself accused, after his death, of having entered into a pact with the devil. A later pope, John the 27th, accused various people around him, including a priest, of trying to harm him with magic in 1380. More serious still were the trials of the Knights Templar early in the 14th century. The Templars owned lands and monies, and an envious King Philip of France, Philip the Fair, saw to it that they were tried as heretics. The charges varied and included sorcery and the making of the pacts with the devil. This high-profile case against such a previously renowned order of knights gave credence to the idea that Satanism was real and flourishing. Indeed, it appears that Philip, for his own political and financial reasons, went out of his way to spread the lurid stories about what the Templars were supposed to have done. The end of the 14th century saw a gradual increase in the number of cases of people accused of using magic combined with worshiping with the devil. In 1390, for example, 2 women said under torture that they had invoked the devil as part of their magic rituals. Continental Europe, an important development came in 1398. When the theological faculty of the University of Paris announced that the practice of harmful magic, malitia, was a heresy if it entailed a pact with the devil. Since many Christian authorities insisted that invoking any spirits during magic was itself evidence of such a pact, this pronouncement laid witchcraft wide open to charges of heresy. The beginning of the 15th century saw a trickle of prosecutions and burnings in parts of continental Europe. During the 1420s, around 200 witches were tried around Briançon in France, close to the Italian and Swiss borders. Similar trials took place in Switzerland, at Bern, Lucerne, and Basel. Others occurred in Germany, which became and remained one of the centers of witch trials over the next couple hundred of years. Already the trials were beginning to show patterns. Local inquisitors would confront the accused with a list of supposed acts that they had committed. These acts conformed to what were to become the standard witchcraft accusations of the time: that the witches met regularly at Sabbaths, had sex with others, including the devil, harmed or killed or even ate children, formally renounced Christ, and also mocked the sacraments of the church. Torture was routinely used to extract these confessions. Another important development amid the steady trickle of witch trials came the 1484, when Pope Innocent VIII issued a bull, formal written statement that gave full papal backing for the work of local inquisitors against witchcraft. The most infamous treaty against witchcraft, and possibly one of the most influential, was the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487. Its title translates into English as the hammer of women who practice harmful magic. The Malleus was written by a member of the Dominican order who was an inquisitor in South Germany. The book, which enjoyed a number of reprints in later years, was given greater authority by Institorus, cleverly using the 1884 papal bull as a preface, this giving the idea that the contents had the full backing of Rome. This book seemed to have been written in response to problem Institorus that faced with a bishop in southern Germany. The bishop had disapproved some of the Dominicans' recent rather zealous attempt to prosecute alleged witches. To modern eyes, it is a grotesque, incredible work, and the Malleus was violent in tone, even by the standards of the time. Nevertheless, it was the first coherent attempt to set out the reasons why witches were heretics, to explain what they did, and to set out the way they should be tried and punished. The book states that the key elements of witchcraft and witches include flying through the air, causing impotence to men, killing children, renouncing the church, changing their shape into that of animals, abusing the sacraments, and cruelty, making a pact with demons or the devil. Once practiced, it did not mention, however, was one that later featured in the descriptions of witchcraft, the obscene kiss, where hereby witches greeted the devil with a kiss on his anus. Institorus also sets out why it is the majority of witches, in his view, are female. Women were feeble-minded, more susceptible to superstition, morally weak, and had an insatiable sexual appetite. The author then moves to the legal process and explicitly recognizes the need for torture in obtaining the all-important confession from a witch. It's difficult to judge how influential the Malleus was in inspiring later witch trials, though it is often quoted with approval by others and other writers on the subject, that there is some evidence, for example, that it may have played a part in encouraging trials in Cologne and Trier over the next decade or so. Yet the most virulent outbreak of persecution was to occur a century after this book's original publication. The early 16th century saw momentous religious development, and most historians agree this played a part in the worst years of the witch trials. The name Reformation is given to the movement that caused a tremendous schism between the Catholic Church and reformers led by a German priest named Martin Luther. They created what was later to be called Protestantism. The conflicts and wars between these two faiths over the next century and a half caused massive chaos throughout European society. The Catholic Church had fought successfully against heretics, but here was a popular movement that soon established itself as a serious rival. Meanwhile, Protestants believed that Catholic Church had warped some of the earlier teachings of Christianity. But both sides agreed on one thing: witchcraft was evil and a sign of the devil's work. This was confirmed by Luther himself, who in 1522 declared that witches were the devil's whores, a phase that left little room for doubt as to where he stood on the issue. So there was no respite from witch trials from either side of the religious divide. In fact, by the second half of the century, trials were on the increase, notably in Germany, in what is now Austria, and Catholic ruler Rudolph II presided over widespread persecutions. France, too, was a center for a number of large trials. Early in the 17th century, the trials reached a grisly peak, especially in Germany, where the Catholic-Protestant tension ignited the 30-Year War from 1618 to 48. Cologne saw a spate of trials at this time, spurred by the Archbishop Frederick of Bavaria, as did Bamberg, where the ultra-zealous Prince Bishop Gottfried Gonen George II oversaw the burning of 600 witches or more in the space of only a decade. The trials flourished in both Catholic and Protestant areas of Germany. Large-scale witch hunts also began in the first decade of the century in the Basque region of France. Meanwhile, the craze spread northward in Europe to Scandinavia, which had remained relatively immune to the hunts of the 16th century. The worst period for trials in Jutland in Denmark was between 1617 and 1625. In Sweden and Finland and part of Sweden, the majority of witch trials came much later, still in the 1600s or 1660s and 1670s. The Swedish trials in particular were marked by the apparent evidence that hundreds of children had been victims of or witness to witches' sabbaths. Pretty crazy history, and there's a lot more to come. My next video, I will be going into the Spanish Inquisition and moving forward. I hope that you learned something new in this video, and if you did, that's awesome. History is important to know, and I'm putting this together so that people can experience what has actually happened in our history about witchcraft. We all have ancestors that were living during these pagan times and experiencing this. So yeah, thank you for listening. Subscribe to my channel if you like this, and I look forward to sharing some more history of the witches. Have a great day. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.